Great. Very warm welcome everyone this afternoon to our latest webinar. So part of our Best Me series. So we run a number of webinars for workplaces and any organisations really connected with our public health team here in Medway, and we run them under the umbrella of Best Me in 45. So about sort of 45 minutes to an hour session, just on a particular topic of interest, with some tips of how you can be better in that area, to as a bit of self-improvement and self-care, or for passing that information on to others that you might be supporting in your workplace, family or home life. Let me just go on to the next slide. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I hand over to our guest speaker this afternoon. So just a bit, so as you're aware, public health team are running this course as part of the Medway Healthy Workplaces programme. So it's a programme, workplace wellbeing scheme for organisations in Medway. We work with organisations of all sizes and sector, offering resources, support and training. If you're already part of the programme or work for Medway Council, you're already included in this. If it's not something that's familiar with you and you'd like to know a bit more, let us know in the chat. We can send you some information and have a chat separate from this meeting, tell you a bit more about what's available, and of course you can look it up on the council website as well. And we just ask that delegates do stay on mute during the session. If there's opportunity for questions, we'll ask you to unmute there. It just helps with background noise and interruptions. And make yourself comfortable, have a drink on hand and feel free to take notes. This is actually a little picture from Teams rather than Zoom, but if you do want to send us a message, do use the chat function there, and I will be keeping an eye on that while Helen's talking, and we'll give out a feedback survey at the end. It's really useful to have your feedback from these sessions about the content, the pace, the time of the day and so on, so that we can shape them and improve them in the future. So without any further from me, I'll hand over to Helen and stop sharing my screen so that she can screen share.
Okie doke.
Thank you, Helen.
There we go. Okay, can you see that all right there, Michelle? Yep, I'm seeing thumbs up, so fantastic. Okay, let's get cracking then. Thanks so much everybody for being here. Really good to have so many of you, especially on such a sunny afternoon, because the temptation to just go outside and lap that sun up must be overwhelming. So really appreciate you being here. I'm Helen Lawson from Wellbeing Training Solutions, and I set this business up about 7 years ago, before which I worked in business first, then in education and then in health. And essentially everywhere I went, in every experience I had, whether it was teaching teenagers or dealing with public health, I saw the same issues holding people back all the time. And that's really why I set this business up, was to give me an opportunity to try and support people, support businesses essentially, to be able to give their staff the best support for general day-to-day coping skills. So that's the sort of stuff I do, is talk about resilience, coping with change, uncertainty, stress, resilience, anxiety, as we are here for today. Some people use my services because it ticks a box. Some people use my services because they really do understand that healthier, happier people make a better business. If people feel good about what they do, if they've got the basic coping skills, then they will be in a position to deliver more and to be happier doing it. And that has all sorts of benefits around people being more likely to want to work for the organisation, being retained once they're there, and being more engaged once they're there as well. I do apologise for the binging and bonging going off in the background. That's just as people are asking to be let into the session. So please do ignore that. It's nothing to be concerned about, and it will die down as we get further into the session. So for this session, we're going to tackle anxiety specifically, which is quite pervasive at the moment. It's been talked about an awful lot, and anybody who's got one of your children dealing with exams, for example, you can be sure it will be being talked about a lot. But even if it's not, if you aren't experiencing anxiety at the moment, and you don't know somebody who is, at some stage you will experience it, and you will know somebody who does. So I'm first of all really grateful to you that you've taken the opportunity to come along today, either for yourself or for the benefit of somebody else. And my plea to you before we go any further and get stuck into the material is to say to you, for some reason you decided to be here, whatever that reason was. So I would just really love if now that you are here, you ditch the enemy of all online training, which is your emails, and you try and be here and really in it for the remaining time that we've got, because that is how you'll get the absolute best out of the session. Just be in the moment, be open to the possibilities, and let's see what happens. So let's get stuck in then. On to anxiety. Well, what is it? First of all, anxiety is an emotional response. So it's because we have an emotion, we have emotions, that we respond. Stress and anxiety are very similar. They're both emotional responses, and they have quite similar demonstrations, in terms of the symptoms. They do look very similar, but they are a little bit different. And we'll look at what those differences are. So with anxiety, we need to be aware that it can be mild, that it is an emotional response that we all have. So it's completely natural, completely normal. And yet we seem to have somehow pathologized it somewhere along the line. And people now say things like, oh yeah, well, I have anxiety. I suffer from anxiety. I'm an anxious person. Now, all of those things are valid, but we need to be clear that it is something we all have. Somebody saying that they have it doesn't make them different to anybody else. So if you find yourself quite anxious sometimes, don't feel that there's anything wrong with that. That's just part of who you are, but it's also part of the human experience. And if it's mild and have it now and again, no biggie. If, however, it becomes more severe, then obviously it can become more of a concern. And we'll see when we need to be really worried about it. We might class it as a sense of unease about what might or will happen. And that's probably one of the biggest differences between anxiety and stress. With stress, it tends to be a response to a stimulus. So something happens, your job is at risk, your relationship is in difficulty, finances. These things are happening to you, and as a response, you have a stress response. But with anxiety, it's an unease about what might or will happen, but you don't even know those things are going to happen. So it's a concern about something that isn't even definitely going to happen. And you can experience it as thoughts. So you think about anxious thoughts, or it might be sensations, feelings, emotions that kind of build up in you. And it might be that just general sense of unease, or it can even be experienced in physical sensations like the knot in the stomach or the headache. All of those things can be signs of anxiety, but we also experience thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations as a result of other things. With anxiety, very often we'll think about it being persistent and excessive worries, fears, or tensions. And again, here we have the difference to stress, even when there's no trigger. And unfortunately, it can present itself in some pretty unpleasant fashions. So it might affect your sleep, your concentration, your energy levels, your levels of irritability, and it may even present itself in things like muscle tension that you're not used to. But crucially, what you need to know about anxiety is it is not a diagnosis. There is nothing about anxiety that is a diagnosis. It is an emotional response. Right throughout this presentation, I'm going to ask you to stop now and again and reflect. So what I want you to do is just take a moment to reflect. How are you measuring up against these cues? Do you think this is something that you are experiencing? And I'm not going to ask anybody to share, nothing in the chat. Nobody needs to unmute and tell me. This is about you having the opportunity during this presentation to take those precious moments to think about where you sit. Another thing you need to be aware of is something about a certain kind of personality trait or way of thinking that can make you particularly vulnerable to anxiety. So if you are inclined to take an ambiguous scenario, let's imagine that £100 went out of your bank account and you didn't know why, to where, what happened to it. Or it could be as simple as an email from somebody that often is trouble. So you've got an ambiguous scenario. The money's gone, but you don't know where or why. You haven't had a chance to investigate it yet. But you've jumped to a conclusion that you've been hacked and somebody's now stealing all your money. Or the email has arrived from the person who might sometimes spell trouble, and you've jumped to the conclusion that when they say they want to speak to you, that's going to be bad news. And you might vividly imagine the situation that you have now created in your mind hurtling towards you as if it's actually happening. And you start to anticipate the most dire consequences possible out of what's happening. And then you start to actually experience the thoughts and feelings intensifying, even though nothing has actually changed. You don't know that somebody has got into your bank account. You don't know, for example, that the email that you've received is going to be bad news. But that doesn't stop you getting to a point where the sensations and the thoughts are as if it's actually happening. And that can be more likely in somebody that believes that they can't control their mood state. So, for example, people who say, she put me in a really bad mood. Well, she didn't. I mean, she might have done something, and as a response to that, you went into a bad mood, but she didn't do it. You choose your response, or at least you can once you know how to. And all of that can be summarized as a looming cognitive style. So again, take a moment and just ask yourself, how often do you take a giant leap from what's actually happening to what you think is really happening? And there might be an enormous gulf between the two without any evidence that makes you really anxious. And if these things apply to you, then you may have a looming cognitive style. And if that's the case, it's even more helpful at this point to try and develop some coping strategies, exactly as we're about to do. So when is anxiety a problem then? Well, it becomes a problem, like most mental health conditions, when it starts to affect our day-to-day functioning, when your normal functioning can't go on as it should do. So you're not able to work without these anxieties coming into your mind, or sleep, those kinds of things. It affects your relationships. And that might be because the severity of it when it hits is really strong and it feels very, very overwhelming. Or it might be because the frequency of it, although it might not be terribly overwhelming every time that it happens, but it just happens really often. So either of those things or both of those things might turn it into a bigger problem than just normal day-to-day anxieties. Also, when it's not proportionate. If your level of anxiety about any situation seems to be disproportionate to how other people might deal with it, and I always think we need to be very careful about comparisons, because I'm a great believer that comparison is the thief of joy. But at the same time, you do get a gauge from people around you about what's normal and what's not. So from that point of view, if you feel that your reaction to anxiety is disproportionate, then it might be a problem. But even so, what I would like to reassure everybody is if you are experiencing anxiety in a deeper way than just normal everyday anxiety, it is extremely treatable. And that's normally through either drug therapy, psychological therapies, or maybe a combination of both. So if you do feel like you're falling out of what might be acceptable on a day-to-day basis, just be reassured that that's not a kind of a terrible thing. It's something that can be managed. And I just want to skip very quickly through some diagnoses associated with anxiety, because I've said anxiety is not a diagnosis, but there are diagnoses which have anxiety as a significant component of them. And so when people say I've been diagnosed with anxiety, they probably mean more specifically they've been diagnosed with one of these things. So one of the most common things would be mixed anxiety and depression. And the numbers next to each bullet point basically signal roughly how many people per week in the UK experience this particular thing. So roughly in a week in the UK, about 8 in 100 people will have a diagnosis and be experiencing mixed anxiety and depression. Another diagnosis associated with anxiety is generalized anxiety disorder. Then we've got post-traumatic stress disorder, phobias, obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorder, where we're now getting to much less common areas, and social anxiety disorder. So these are diagnoses. Anxiety in itself is not a diagnosis. So I'm going to ask you all to just take a moment now. If you have your camera on and you want to turn it off, that's absolutely fine. I'm not going to get you to do star jumps or anything, but I am just going to ask you to take a moment. Because one of the big problems we tend to find with anxiety is that our thoughts start to rush and swirl, and they can get very overwhelming. And before we know it, they're kind of leapfrogging over each other and everything speeds up. And that's quite dangerous. So we just want to slow it down. The best time to do it is right now at the beginning of this session, so that you get a moment to actually calm things down and then really take on board everything that you're going to hear from this point onwards. And when I say slow down, we can take an attitude of curiosity to what we're experiencing when anxiety happens. So we will investigate what's going on. And I would ask everybody watching now to do a quick body scan. And all I mean by that is I want you can sit exactly as you are, no need to move, but just from the top of your head, I want you to scan down through your body, through your face, feel whether you might be holding any tension in your jaw. Have you got your neck at an uncomfortable angle? Is there maybe some tension being felt here in the shoulders? And if there is, just try and ease everything out a little bit. You can do it subtly. It doesn't have to be big gestures. And do that right the way through your body, through your torso. What are you feeling in your body? And you'll get down to, is your bottom planted comfortably on your chair? Or maybe do you need to shift yourself a little bit there? Are you holding tension in your knees, or have you got your legs crossed in a way that makes you quite uncomfortable? All the way down to, what are your feet doing? Are your toes curled up because you're holding tension in that? If you planted your feet firmly on the floor, would you feel more grounded? Would that feel better? And once you've done that, I then just want you to feel free to readjust into a more comfortable position for you to go through the rest of this session. Now, body scan takes seconds, but it's a really valuable way to connect in with what's going on inside you. And in terms of anxiety, often we have thoughts and feelings and physical sensations combining to make our mind race through anxious thoughts. And if we can just slow all that down and check, well, what's happening in my physical person? Can I improve that? Our physiology affects our psychology. So it's a really valuable exercise to do every now and again. Just be present. I just want to ask you here and now, if you are prone to anxiety, at this moment in time, what is the anxiety? Because the truth is, for most of us, at this moment in time, I've got no need to be anxious. There is no immediate threat. We're not like our ancient ancestors who were worried about the predator around the corner. We don't have terribly scary environments, but we're still hardwired, unfortunately, for those feelings, which is why we get anxiety, and why, even though our environment is so much safer than our ancient ancestors experienced, we tend to have the same physiological and psychological reactions to much smaller stimuli. So ask yourself, am I all right now? And if I am all right now, great, let's move on. Check that your feet are grounded. If you do start to get carried away with your thinking, sometimes that can be really helpful. You might want to try some breathing techniques. One breathing technique which people find very helpful, and there's a good evidence base behind it. Everything we talk about has an evidence base, is the 4-7-8 breathing technique. And if you're not familiar, all that means really is that you would take in a deep breath for 4 seconds, you'd hold it for 7 seconds, and then you breathe it out with your tongue just behind your top teeth, so that as you breathe out, you kind of go through pursed lips. And if you do that just for 4 repetitions, it interrupts the ability for you to keep thinking the anxious thought, and it also helps with your physiology and can calm everything down. And you might want to repeat it. You can do that twice and do it several times a day. Any of those sorts of things or other breathing techniques will help. But you just want to interrupt that speeding cycle that tends to come with anxiety. And then when you've done it, when you've done your body scan and you've done the breathing technique, reflect. What did that do for me? Did it help? Did it not help? Did it just make me feel uncomfortable or silly? But then take the learning from that and repeat whatever works whenever you can and whenever you feel that you need it to help with the anxiety. So let's understand a bit more about anxiety and our power over it. The first thing to note is it really can be a habit. You know, it's not necessarily just part of who we are. We can turn it into a habit. And again, I want you to reflect, has it become a habit for you? Have you just, you know, for one reason or another, something made you anxious one day and then all of a sudden you became more anxious about all sorts of things? For lots of people, actually, lockdown was a trigger for that. But then there might be any number of other things too. But the really good news is that any habit that can be learned can be unlearned. So if you do find yourself anxious a lot of the time, you can change that. And we'll talk about loads of things that you can do to do that. But anxiety is rarely ever about anything that's happening in the here and now. You might get anxiety about whether you said or did the wrong thing at a party you went to on Saturday night. And you might experience anxiety about an interview that you are expecting you might get an invitation to. But very rarely, when we look at what's happening here and now, do we need to be anxious. The other thing is that anxiety can be invisible. So be aware that the people around you who seem like they've got it all together, that is not necessarily the case. We probably all know the expression about the swans who are out there making everything look really easy, and they're gliding on the surface of the water, but underneath they're paddling like mad. There are so many people who are swans and look like they've got it all together, but that doesn't stop them from experiencing anxiety. So never make the assumption that the outward version of what you see is what's really going on the inside. And also, anxiety is a cruel liar. Anxiety will, in one way or another, try and confirm to you that you need to be anxious. And that once you've started to be anxious, the only way to resolve the anxiety is to keep thinking the anxious thought. So do be aware that that isn't true, because ultimately thoughts and feelings are not facts. A thought is a thought, but my thought is different to your thought. So it isn't a fact. A feeling, which might give you a sensation that you need to be anxious about something, is not a fact. Only facts are facts. So when you start to think or feel anxious thoughts, you need to see, am I really being realistic about this? Is this true? And I'm going to mention again, look at it with curiosity, and we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. But you've got to give yourself a fighting chance. And actually, if you're not just looking after yourself, just looking after the basics, then you are not giving yourself a fighting chance. In terms of looking after yourself, the sorts of things we're talking about are your human connections. We are human beings. We were designed to be in tribes. We do not do well on our own. We now know that social isolation cuts about 10 years off of somebody's life, and it's equivalent roughly to smoking about 15 cigarettes a day. We cannot cope without other people, because in our ancient ancestry, if you were cut off from the tribe, cast out, you knew you wouldn't survive. You couldn't go it alone in that environment. You couldn't do all things. You couldn't hunt, you couldn't gather, you couldn't look after everything about your well-being 24 hours a day. So there is a deep-seated, hardwired fear in us about not having connections. So you really need to foster and reward those connections. And that's so important, because often other stuff takes over, the emails, the social media, whatever it might be. I guarantee you nobody is going to lie on their deathbed and say, oh, I wish I'd answered a few more emails, or I wish I'd spent a bit more time on social media. The only things people tend to regret are about connections. It's about spending time with other people. Historically, over the last 80 years, there has been a study done which looked at what people actually felt in their final hours, days, and women tended to say that they wish they'd worried less about what other people thought about them, which ties in very nicely with anxiety, and men tended to say that in truth they wish they'd spent less time working. But obviously 80 years is a long time, so it goes back to a time when more women wouldn't have worked. You need to think about your diet and hydration. If your basics, if any of you know, and I know we've got some people here from education, if you know anything about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that you've got to look after these basic needs at the bottom, your food, your diet, your shelter, those things at the very bottom, and then we start to work up to the more important stuff. So if you aren't well fed, if you aren't well hydrated, particularly in this sort of weather, you can't expect yourself to function well. It just won't happen. there are so many expressions, you know, whether you put your oxygen mask on first, or whether it's that you can't pour from an empty vessel. But these are the things you have to do to be able to think logically. And anxiety can be a kind of a step of misthinking. Consumption. Think about your consumption. Now, when I say consumption, I'm not now talking about diet and water or fluid. I'm talking about your consumption of the world outside, whether that's toxic people that are bringing you down, or whether it is social media or the media. If those things generate anxiety in you, which for many, many people they do, but they don't stop long enough to think about it, it can make a massive difference. And to illustrate how much of a difference it can make, there was research done soon after the Boston bombing. And what they discovered was that people who watched news feeds for 6 hours or more a day, and I know 6 hours sounds like a lot, but for some people, if they're at home, or even if you just go and sit in a reception of a lot of buildings, they will have a news channel on all day long. For people who experienced more than 6 hours of news during the period after the Boston bombing, their stress levels, their stress response was even worse than the people who were there when the bombing happened. So if you think that the media can't impact how you feel, you're very much mistaken. It can have a really, really big impact. And if you look at social media, I mean, for me personally, I've come off Twitter because I think it's poisonous. I just don't watch the 10 o'clock news ever. That's the last thing I need before I go to bed. So think about your consumption, your diet of things other than food and liquid. Move. Our bodies need to move, and it's also a really important stress reliever to move. Now, I don't mean you have to go for a run or join a gym. I just mean move. It's a way to get some of those hormones out of the body that might be less helpful. Sleep. Look at your sleep hygiene. Are you looking after your sleep hygiene properly? Are you making sure that you get enough sleep? Rest. Rest and sleep are not the same things. There's got to be that bit in between productivity, and sleep. And that's got to be the downtime. And finally, joy. You might have planned your finances. You might have planned your career. You might have planned all these different things. But it was Michelle Obama that says we don't spend enough time planning our joy. So if you have good things to look forward to, then that's much more helpful in terms of managing anxiety. And the only reason I should explain why we've got a picture of a dog there is because I think we could all be a bit more dog. And all I mean by that is that dogs are in the moment. They're not worrying about last Saturday, and they're not worried about next Monday. They care about their people. They've got their connections. They want to be fed and watered and move. They sleep a lot, they rest a lot, and they certainly know how to have joy. So if we can get out of our heads and into our bodies a little bit more and into our present moment and our experiences, we can all be maybe a little bit more dog. So are you wasting your energy? Is your anxiety just wasting your time and your energy? This little illustration comes from the work of Stephen Covey and his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And if any of you have seen me present before, you probably will have seen this slide because I use it for just about everything. I think it is probably one of the most valuable things I've ever learned. And in terms of feedback, one of the most valuable things most people get out of sessions. And what it's showing you is that you have sort of 3 circles in your life. The inner circle is your circle of control. So when I say that, what I mean is that circle contains everything that you can control, i.e. this. The only things in life I can control is myself, my actions, my reactions, nothing else. The next, oh, I'm sorry, has the screen changed in front of you there? I seem to have got something pop up. Let me see. Sorry, I don't know why that's happened. Is that better? Yeah. Okay, we're back to normal. Apologies. I'm not sure what happened there. Yes, so the next circle out of that, the amber or orange circle, that's your circle of influence. And in your circle of influence, that's the stuff that you can't directly control, but you can do something about. So your boss, your colleagues, your students, your customers, your children, your partner. You can't control what they do, but you can certainly give them a bit of a steer about what would be helpful for you and how you would like things to go. even when it comes down to a much wider scale, it might be politics. You can't control who's in charge in the government, but you can certainly influence it by how you vote and who you vote for. So we've got a circle of circle of control, which is us. We've then got our circle of influence, the stuff we can do beyond that, but we can't directly control the result. And then the final circle, the outside circle, is our circle of concern, or I would call it our circle of acceptance, because that's the stuff we can't do anything about. And that's where anxiety often sits. It sits in that bit where we can't do anything about it, and yet we are allowing it to take over a huge amount of our energy and our time, which then saps everything out of us and prevents us from making better choices about whether we're going to be anxious about something or not. So if we can decide that we will analyze what we're thinking about and decide, can I control it? Can I influence it? Or do I just have to accept it? And once we know we have to accept it because it's in our circle of concern and we can't change it, we can start to bring the information in a little bit and say, well, is there anything I can do to influence it? Or is there anything I can do that controls, if not it, me and how I respond to it? And that can be enormously helpful for just being a bit more analytical, a bit more evidence-based about your anxieties. Because if we don't do that, what can tend to happen is we get into rumination. And the American Psychiatric Association say that rumination involves repetitive thinking or dwelling on negative feelings and distress and their causes and consequences. I mean, even that sentence goes on forever. It kind of feels like an anxious sentence to me. Repetitive thinking, negative feelings, distress, causes, consequences. And then they say that the repetitive negative aspect of rumination can contribute to the development of depression or anxiety and can worsen existing conditions. So we know now what rumination is. I'm going to ask you to stop and think for yourself again. Do you experience rumination? Do you find yourself repetitively thinking about or dwelling on negative things? And if you do, let's see whether some of the rest of what we've got to look at might be helpful. So we're going to look at, how is your thinking? You know, how do you do in terms of thinking? And I ask that because very often we confuse problem solving with rumination. We think that by going over a problem again and again and again in our minds, we are going to solve it. But more often than not, we don't even know that the problem is going to happen. And if we don't know that the problem is going to happen, how can we possibly solve it? So what we'll tend to do is generate in our mind 6 ways this thing might go. And then, because we've got so many options about what might happen, because it hasn't happened yet, then we've got to generate the 6 things might happen in response to each of those things, and so on and so on. And before you know it, we've blown it into this enormous problem with so many potential problems within and solutions that we aren't problem solving at all. We're ruminating. But it makes us feel better to think we're doing something about it, when in truth, all we're doing is escalating our anxiety. And there is a solution to that. And that solution is called meta thinking, which basically just means thinking about thinking. So the next time that you find yourself veering off into rumination and going over the same things again and again, when there is nothing you can do to control or influence it, you're totally in that circle of concern, then think about your thinking. Use curiosity, as I mentioned earlier, to calm it. And the way you do that is to say, that's an interesting thought. So you get the anxious thought, and instead of allowing that to create another thought and another thought and another thought, you just say, that's an interesting thought. I wonder where that came from. Why did I think about that? What triggered it? Do I have an error in the way that I'm thinking that is causing me to come up with this suggestion in my head, which actually is not based in any evidence at all? Are there different ways that I could look at this problem? And each time anxiety comes up, first of all, thinking like this gives you a distraction from the anxious thought. And secondly, it's really helpful for trying to understand where those anxious thoughts come from and then being able to calm them. And I would say that a really good follow-up to that would be, okay, if I'm going to spend my time being anxious about it, I've queried where it's come from. I'm curious about it now. Rather than allow myself to be anxious, I'm going to try and shift that to a level of curiosity. Try and work out, could I look at it differently? And crucially, is there an action I can take that will make me feel better? Is there something I can do about this anxiety that will make me feel better? And if there is, do that thing instead of thinking about all the different possibilities. And that can be a really helpful way to look at things, to essentially become an emotional detective and look at the evidence. And if there isn't any evidence for what you're imagining, then try and be realistic about that and move on. And another thing that an anxious person does a lot is they ask, what could go wrong? And we can find a million things that could go wrong. What could go wrong? Well, just about everything could go wrong, really, couldn't it? But a much better question to ask is, what could go right? Now, I want to be really clear that I am not talking here about toxic positivity. I'm not talking about a situation where you say, oh, well, yes, I do feel unhappy about that, but we all have to present our best side to the world and pretend everything's okay. That's not a good thing for anybody to do. Toxic positivity is when you try and pretend that you feel differently than you do, and you pretend to other people that you feel differently that you do, and you don't deal with the things that you're experiencing. Absolutely no place for that in wellbeing at all. However, the question is, can I think of it differently? So if we look back at lockdown, that was a brilliant example of, first of all, the people that coped really well tended to be people who accepted early on what was happening. The people who didn't want to accept it really struggled because they were spending all that time in the outer circle, unhappy about what was happening, but they couldn't change it. And so it took a long time for those people to kind of get on board and start to work through the other issues of, how do I deal with it? So acceptance is one thing. But the other thing is, when you think about the stuff that you're anxious about, maybe it's an interview, maybe it's having to do a presentation, maybe it's meeting people, it might be social anxiety, then the question really could be reframed, what could go wrong? Which we don't consciously think that question, we just start to generate the answers to that question. And instead, if we switch it to, what could go right? What opportunities might there be? Might there be something in this that I enjoy or I learn from? And if we can do that, then we tend to find many, many things far less stressful. Or you can reframe that question again and perhaps just put yourself down as a realistic optimist. And I'm going to ask everybody to take a moment again and reflect on themselves. Do you consider yourself to be an optimist? Things will be great regardless. Do you consider yourself a pessimist? Things will probably be terrible regardless. Do you consider yourself a realist? Well, things will probably be all right. Or do you consider yourself a realistic optimist? Now, there was a psychiatrist called Marmot, and he was working with people with some of the most serious psychiatric disorders that there were. So people with really big problems, not day-to-day anxiety, really big problems. And he asked them, on average, what proportion of your life is unearned good compared to unearned bad? And even people with those really serious problems said that on average, they thought they probably had unearned good about 10 to 1 times more than unearned bad. They really felt that most of their life had still been good to them, even though they hadn't earned it, good things had happened. So realistic optimism is about that. Realistic optimism is about looking at your life and saying, where's the evidence? Do things normally turn out right? Do things normally turn out okay? And actually, it is realistic for me to be an optimist, because most of the time the experiences are good. That way of thinking, again, not toxic positivity, it's about looking for the evidence and asking yourself, is that true? And I really hope it is for everybody that's watching. But the reason it's really important is because you then start to notice more of the good stuff. And when you do that, you become even more aware that it is more likely that things will turn out well. So being a realistic optimist is a great way to confront life, to go forward, believing that most things, most situations can bring you to a good outcome at the end of it. And if we don't manage to do that, if we don't manage to be optimistic, not blindly optimistic, everything will just turn out all right regardless, but realistically optimistic that if I put my bit into this as well, things will probably be all right. So it's not just it's going to happen. I know I've got to do my bit. This is not, you know, stapling the £50 note to the ceiling, staring at it and assuming that much more money is going to come your way. You know, you've got to do your bit too. But if we don't manage to get that under our belts, then what we can tend to do is become avoidant. We want to avoid situations, and that's not great either. And that's why we've got this slide about avoiding avoidance, because one of the worst things we can possibly do for anxiety is avoid situations that make us anxious. So whether it is a presentation or a meeting or a social setting, whatever it might be, if you find yourself constantly trying to avoid that thing, you just turn it into a bigger problem. It's completely natural to want to pull away from the things that make us anxious because we generally don't want to experience the emotions that are less positive. There are no bad emotions, but we all know we have positive emotions and negative emotions, and we tend to want to avoid the negative emotions. And so we pull away from the things that give us negative emotions. But when we do that, we make that thing become bigger and scarier because we haven't done it now for so long that it's a much bigger deal. But the much better way to deal with it is to actually confront it, not in a massive way that's overwhelming, but with tiny little steps to get you closer to where you want to be. So if you're an anxious person, what you will tend to see on this slide is a red flag. And we all know that red flags are things that we want to avoid. Well, it is a red flag. There's no escaping that. But a red flag doesn't necessarily mean danger. It might just be on a golf course and it's pointing you towards a hole, or it might be a marker in somebody's garden. A red flag isn't always a danger, but somebody who is anxious might see it as such. And then they will want to avoid that situation. But a much better way to approach that is, instead of saying, I see that, I recognize it, and I am not going to go towards it because I want to avoid it, is to ask yourself instead, I know I'm afraid, but am I actually at risk? I know I'm afraid, but is there really a danger here? And in very many cases, the things that we avoid, the things that we're anxious about, aren't actually things that are putting us at any risk whatsoever. And yet we pull away and give them power. So if instead of doing that, we can try to say, well, let me measure the risk. Let me see whether it is worth me taking a step towards in a comfortable fashion, pushing my boundaries a little bit and seeing whether I can get better at it before I make the next step. That's a much more helpful approach. Another thing you can do is car park the concern. And what I mean by that is that sometimes when you're dealing with anxious thoughts, they tend to become very pervasive. They come into all areas of your life when you least want them. So there are some things you can do to try and stop that happening. The first thing you can do is write it down. Write down what you're anxious about, so that you know that that thought is not going to disappear. You're not going to forget about it, and then all of a sudden this anxiety jumps up and bites you because you forgot to think about it enough. Once it's written down, it's safe, it's secure, you can come back to it when you're ready. And then in the meantime, you can live your life. Now, for me, I would do this. For me, anxiety start to go over in my head normally just before sleep. So I would write the things down that I'm anxious about just before I go to sleep. And then my brain can switch off and relax because it knows it's still going to be there in the morning and I can pick it up if I need to. For some people, they would rather do that first thing in the morning so that when they go through their day, they're not distracted by it. Get on and live your life. And then when you feel you need to, revisit and check the anxiety that you had against reality. And you might do that quite regularly to start with, but over time, what you will probably find is that your list of anxieties that you wrote a month ago, 1 month on, they are no longer things that you feel any need to be anxious about. In fact, what you have confirmed by having written it down was that you spent a lot of time worrying about something that never came to fruition. And that builds your evidence base that you don't need to be so worried and that you can let some of this stuff go. And then you can repeat and reuse the learning. And that's where the magic happens. That's what we start to do. And we are really close to the end of the presentation because we said that we would leave sort of 10 minutes at the end for any questions or any feedback that you've got. But I do just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts before we finish up. This quote is from John Kabat-Zinn, who's sort of the godfather of modern mindfulness. And he says that you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. And the sorts of coping mechanisms that we've talked about today in terms of anxiety, they're really valuable because you can take them with you through life in all sorts of different situations. The anxiety won't necessarily stop. Life isn't going to stop coming at you, but what you can do is begin to learn how to surf that, how to interact with it in a much more positive fashion. And when you do that, that gives you a better outlook. And I say at the end of every training session, you know, I hope you found this helpful. I hope that it's been informative. I hope that you've got lots out of it. But knowledge is not power, despite what everybody tells us. The application of knowledge is power. So if you have found things within this session that you think they're really interesting, or I might be able to do something with that, then do remember that just knowing it isn't going to make a difference to you and how you feel. The thing that will make the difference is assimilating that into your day-to-day life and doing something about it. And so from that point of view, my request for you as you leave this session is that you would try and find at least one thing that from this session that you think you will go away and do differently, because that's what's going to make the difference, is doing something differently. And hopefully you will do it with some realistic optimism, and you'll get a little bit more analytical, and you'll start to be an emotion detective and understand more about what's going on. And before we move on to the questions, just in case anybody does need to disappear, I do just want to say an enormous thank you to you for coming along this afternoon, for giving up your time, for taking the opportunity to look after yourself and contributing in a way to your well-being, which can only ultimately benefit other people as well. So I'll stop my share there and we will open up to any questions. Feel free, you can either pop them in the chat or you can unmute and have a chat, whichever you prefer. Stunned silence. If there are no, sorry, carry on, Michelle.
My headphones sort of stopped working for a second, and so I switched to another pair, but I've got them working again. I just wanted to say a big thank you, Helen, for a really insightful, useful session. I have put the link to our feedback form in the chat, so if you could click on that form, it's a Microsoft form, and fill that in before you head off for the day. We really appreciate your feedback. And there's also our link to our training portal. So if you click on that, you do need to register, but if you search webinar, it will come up with other webinars that we're running. If anyone got any questions, though, if you want to, feel free to unmute, or if you want to just type them in the chat, I can read those out to Helen for you.
And if you don't have any questions, but if there is something that you found particularly helpful, then it would be great to see that in the chat as well, because then we're in a position where we can try and replicate the things that really work for people, the stuff that you think you'll be able to take away.
Yeah, and I'll stop the recording now as well, because I think we've finished the main content. So thank you again.
Thanks.